the founders of Carmel-by-the-Sea's art colony.
They were the great sentients. They felt all of life more deep and raw. The inferno of their beloved city dispatched a collective dark night of the soul that wiped their domestic slates clean. Carmel-by-the-Sea proved a blank canvas upon which to repaint their lives. Entire worlds sprang to life from the tips of their pencils, pens, and brushes, bringing forth a space few women had walked before. Liberated women, women who demanded equality with their male contemporaries. Unique literary universes concocted while picnicking on powdered sugar sand. Erudite debates around literature, philosophy, and ancient text inspiring new thoughts brought by the muses in moonlight masquerades. They were the adopters of a free and lively lifestyle, breaking the moral stranglehold of the Victorian era.
The original Bohemians, and you see that picture, there's that famous picture of them on the beach, and there's Mary Austin, and George Sterling, and Jack London, and Jimmy Hopper. And they were like the four musketeers. Between the four of them, they knew everybody, or everybody knew them. They were a huge draw. People came to visit George, visit Mary, sit in Mary's treehouse and watch her write.
Mary Austin had a treehouse. They built their homes out of natural materials.
When you imagine Mary Austin sitting in her treehouse with the waves crashing in the distance, what an environment to create original works.
They gathered and they found this hollow, which is still there, nestled in the trees, where they had benches, backless benches, and they could do these pageants and these plays.
And they used to get together and read their private theatricals. That's what they called them. I love that term, private theatricals.
Their desire was to do regional works. Evidently, Jack London wrote a play that bombed on the stage. Mary Austin, of course, wrote The Arrowmaker and Fire. And I think they're bringing that heritage or that history to the regional area is essential. There's Robert Louis Stevenson, and there's the woman he loved, Casa Bonifacio Monterey. And along comes Herbert Herron and writes a play called Tusitala. Stevenson lived his life out in the Samoan Islands. He was worshipped by the Samoans so much they called him Tusitala, which translates teller of tales. And Herbert Herron writes this evidently an epic play about Tusitala. And the characters in the play, it's fascinating because these are characters from Treasure Island.
So they'd meet at the Pine Inn in the lobby, or they'd meet at the Carmel bathhouse to read to each other, to support each other, to fight with each other, to stage parades and parties and community festivals and community events.
Abalone, 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 and chunks of abalone, and chunks of abalone.
Jack London contributed lyrics, George Sterling, Mary, they all contributed lyrics to this little ditty about pounding abalone on the beach. And that, again, was part of it, was the fire pit with the roasting abalone and mussels, steamed mussels, and living off the land.
Abalone at that time was relatively abundant. It was delicious. It was a staple of their diets, and it was an aphrodisiac, they believed.
Some like ham, some like jam, where'er the coast is stony. But our tomcat stays nice and fat on chunks of abalone, 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 and chunks of abalone.
We artists have always been known for having fun, okay, and there's part of that bohemian feel to it.
Hang out in the forest in togas. I mean, these guys they were the original toga parties, okay? They were having toga parties in Carmel in the forest in 1905.
George Sterling had a very unusual lifestyle living in the forest, and he would preside in his Greek garb as his friends gathered, and they would have ceremonies and rituals of which we don't know most of the details. George Sterling had several elements of his dark side.
I mean, they were a serious group about their art. They believed that they had a limited amount of time.
There was this sort of darker undertone to the early Bohemian artists.
And as a result, they they were these stars, that burned bright and then burned out. Robinson Jeffers and others would come in and take this town to its next level.
But what is the fabric of a true bohemian? What drives this often intense and difficult way of being? Who were these women who dared? Moving beyond the simple cliches, we will hear the personal accounts from friends, descendants, and modern Bohemian souls.
Bohemian means, according to George Sterling, was a respect and work in the 7 arts and also poverty. I think that that's what really drives a bohemian, is pursuing the art with passion and poverty.
Unrelenting pressure, ticking financial time bombs. The artistic ecosystem is a hungry ghost. Certain genres require more financial support to create.
Photography is such a precious surface. You can't have any scratches in it or dents, or it's very limited surface to it. It's not like painting or any other sort of discipline. So there's a very regimented way that you make and do a print. Take the photograph, you develop the film, you make a print. So it's a process that you go through. A lot of people with digital, once they get it on their monitor, they're done with it. That's not photography. Photography's hanging, as you see in this house, up on the wall. And that printing process is so important. It's 50% of the challenge of producing a piece of art is the printing, and not just having it on a monitor.
Modern bohemian Michelle Magdalena's artistic journey has created dynamic visual statements. Her expression of handmade craft becomes more uncommon with each passing decade.
My art form is technically photography. The Westons have always been supportive of me and the entire community. I feel like they are single-handedly keeping photography not just alive, but thriving on the peninsula. They do a scholarship. They've given away over $100,000 to high school and college students to buy equipment or whatever they need to do to continue.
I think the first year we had 12 entries. We had 100 portfolios submitted this year to be judged. Yeah. So, and some of the dark rooms that were disappearing came back. Everyone I knew was a photographer in my family, and even when I would go to someone else's house, I would say, "Where's your dark room?" Because I figured everyone had a dark room. Yeah, I love being in the dark, and there's water running all the time, and it's very, very pleasing, very satisfying. I've had people come here that go into my grandfather's darkroom and they start crying because they've followed his career their whole lives. That some of his images have changed people's lives on how they look at photography as an art form.
Of course, I learned about Edward Weston in school, and I think that he set a standard for the potential of photography in a technical and an artistic way.
Weston's work was unique, stirring, more controlled. He would pre-visualize the final print prior to making the exposure.
I just love Edward Weston's way of seeing light, and he definitely, his work captures that simplicity and that resonance that really makes you want to look at something.
Perhaps no work was more provocative than Pepper 30. There were many sexual interpretations. However, Edward refused to define his work.
That's why the pepper is so amazing. It is a pepper, and that's it. And there's beauty in stuff that is just what it is. Yeah. After Edward was through photographing the vegetables in Pepper 30, they would sit and eat it. They would put it in the salad. And there was always a fight between my dad and my Uncle Brett. Brett always said he ate Pepper 30. Dad said, no, I ate Pepper 30. But if you think about it, it's just kind of bizarre that, it's such an iconic image.
Edible icons and exquisite bending of light set Edward Weston's work apart and created value in the marketplace.
When Edward died, in his will he left all the negatives to my father, with the stipulation that he could print them. And one of the criteria was he could print them, but he had to sell them for more than $35. Couldn't sell them for less than $35. And of course, at that time, you could pick up original Edward Westons for $300, $400. One went at auction a few years ago for $1.6 million. And it goes back to, Edward never sold a print for more than $35. That's the art world. It's a different story.
Art prices inflate once the supply is extinguished. An odd game rarely won prior to the artist's departure.
I never wanted to be poor, I didn't feel that would influence me. And that, I always made a living. I worked in carpentry for 30 years, just so that, I could do my photography. And I didn't have to rely on selling prints for a living. If I did that, I would definitely be a poor person, but I like money. Money will buy me the stuff that gives me the freedom to create.
Even if finances are flowing, Mother Nature may rise up as an unplanned provocateur. Arnold Genta, favorite portrait artist of the elite, found himself a refugee overnight after the San Francisco earthquake, losing a majority of his life's work in printed photographs and negatives. His photos of early San Francisco's Chinatown was the only collection that survived.
Genta recorded one of the most vivid recollections of the San Francisco 1906 earthquake. It was amazingly precise in terms of the detail of people fleeing from their homes after the quake. The general scene, he said, was not of great panic, but it was of resolute and relatively rapid seeking of protection. People didn't know where to go. He talked of the martial law, where people would try to enter a building or get into a place that the authorities would not allow, and they would be guns would be pointed at them, and they would be told not to go in there. So it was a scary time.
Men were often made to clear debris by gunpoint. Bohemians had never been too keen on doing what they were told. The forced work and loss of residence had them looking for fresh inspiration.
Well, Bohemian's an interesting word because it means so many different things to different people. For me, in Carmel, when people mention the word, they think of the Bohemian art colony.
The early Carmel art colony was really a rather primitive stage. It was mostly a forest with a few unpaved roads. Many of the artists were living in tents while they were having their cabins built, or maybe just kept living in tents. It was bohemian in the sense that many of the artists were poor. They were all addicted to their art.
Peters Gate, that's up in Monterey, that's the entrance to what was then an art community.
Charles Rollo Peters was actually the first resident artist in the Monterey art colony.
I think that's why the art colony grew so fast. Just one example is Charles Rollo Peters, how he inspired. He was great friends with Arnold Genta, the photographer.
The house was a mercurial magnet for the aristocratic avant-garde.
Well, we are in the living room of my home, and this house was built by Charles Rollo Peters, who was a renowned nocturnal artist. He actually bought 30 acres, built this house, and built behind a studio and guest house. All these friends of his had lost everything up in San Francisco after the 1906 earthquake. So he invited them here, and he said, come to Monterey, it's a beautiful place to paint, and I'll help you find places to live. So they moved into the guest house. He added on rooms here. He added 2 little shacks that were like 10 by 12s, and it became like a little artist community.
He achieved fame in his lifetime as a nocturne painter. His principal theme was darkness. He would take a subject which could be painted any time of day and really paint it by dim moonlight or candlelight, whether it was an old adobe or a seascape.
For example, his first show in New York sold out, and these are paintings of California, of Monterey, the Monterey adobes.
I mean, you need a lot of light on it just to see the little bits that are happening, but it's intriguing, it's calming, it's mysterious.
Peters' Gate became the threshold that welcomed both buyer and bohemian at the home of the famed painter by the same name, at the painter's eponymous home.
He would throw lavish parties. He really was one of the figures that brought all the artists together.
And what do artists need besides beauty and painting and fun and community and food? You also need to have someone buy your stuff.
Eventually, the Del Monte Hotel began hanging the art in a gallery and making it a focal point where people would go to the gallery to look at artworks and even be able to buy these artworks from the artist.
The most beautiful hotel in the world that was ever built, with trains that came right to it, the wealthiest people coming. So this was perfect. And then on horse and buggy, they would have parties in this living room so that the wealthy could meet the new artists of the day.
Joaquin Turner found inspiration in the ethereal light of the nocturne and now owns his own gallery in Carmel-by-the-Sea.
I discovered the early Monterey artists, and at the Monterey Museum of Art, I actually stumbled upon a large Charles Rollo Peters retrospective, and I was just blown away by his work. It was just so bold and yet subtle.
We are the only nationally accredited museum between Santa Barbara and San Francisco. So it is really very important for us to hold the history of our community and for California.
Artist Joaquin Turner connected with his life's calling through the museum's outreach program, bringing him face to face with the work of early California masters at the tender age of 12.
At 12, 13 years old, I was begging my parents for painting lessons. And first they're like, oh sure, we'll give you some art classes or drawing lessons. And I said, no, I want to learn to paint in oils, because that's what the old masters were painted in.
From a young art student to full-time artist and gallery owner, Joaquin found a unique way of giving back to his community.
An art walk, I thought, was the best way.
Joaquin and fellow artists open their studios to the public and invite new relationships to form.
I found out once you tell them that it was a Bohemian art colony before it was even established as a town and all, then they look at it in a whole different way. Once you tell them that there's still local artists here, trying to keep that spirit alive, amongst all the commercial galleries, then they think that's cool. We got all 19 artists on board, and we started meeting on a monthly basis. We started having, after parties and get-togethers after the walk with just the artists, and we're trying to recreate that, bring back the camaraderie and friendship and support, which we all need, because running your own gallery is not the easiest thing to do. It's about 75 to almost 80% of my paint sales now are to repeat customers. I mean, when they come to town, often we'll go out to dinner, and I've developed so many friendships, just true friendships from running the gallery.
Carmel itself is more of an artistic community, and so outside of that daily life and living, there's the creation of art, the perpetuation of community activities, the activation of connection between the community to come together and make unified choices.
Teetotaler Mary Danielle Morgan was a mighty diplomat amid the more boozy bohemians.
Mary Danielle Morgan was the peacemaker. She was one of the founders of the Carmel Arts and Crafts Club, but more importantly, she was a continuing force. She is undoubtedly one of the most important painters in American history. She was not interested in the power or prestige, but she was interested in the betterment of everything that she thought was good. So she was the founder of the Red Cross chapter in Carmel in World War I and got others actively involved so that they were really creating goods and services that could be sent over to Europe. Bear in mind, these were all artists and people of not great resources, but she encouraged this kind of giving. She and her brother Thomas were instrumental, really were the designers of the All Saints Episcopal Church, which has become Carmel City Hall. So she was involved in architectural progress. She was also vitally interested in the Carmel Mission Restoration Project, where she and Laura Maxwell were the prime donors, where they would donate paintings of theirs to raise money for the restoration in the mid-teens.
In 1927, married to Neil Morgan and 19 pioneers assembled as the founding members of Carmel's cornerstone gallery, the Carmel Art Association.
It's a jointly owned gallery, second oldest in the country.
The idea of it from the very beginning, where it would be a place for the community to show their work.
The Carmel Art Association, being here since 1927, has an international fame, has an international fan club, international clientele, international collectors. We have the unique luxury of being able to have all these wonderful living artists. And we have about 80 to 90 artists monthly bring in brand new artworks. So we kind of tout the fact that we are probably one of the few organizations on the planet, okay, and certainly on the West Coast, that has a brand new show that opens up every month with all brand new artworks from our living, working, creating members.
Really, it's not just about collecting dead artists. We have to keep the community vibrant by keeping the artists who are working and living alive and thriving.
The resonance of Bohemian collaboration lives on through the stewardship of artist Elizabeth Murray.
My hope was to buy an artist house where I could write and paint and teach and show my work and sell it. And so this was a major dream. And it actually has 9,000 pounds of steel in this living room because it was collapsing. Because the engineer that came said, no, this isn't structurally sound. I cannot guarantee this. But where else are you going to find a house like that? And I told the city that if they could help me buy this and I would restore it, if they could somehow work with me with grants or whatever, that I would continue that spirit of place to have artists meet and to help, to help art go out into the world in a refreshed and new way. And I know many times I was it gives me a lump in my throat, but just like down to $30, and I didn't know how I was going to make my mortgage. I didn't, it was like, and then somebody would come. I've had so many miracles where somebody would come, I don't know how, a friend of a friend, somehow, something through gardening. They go, oh, I really like that. And they would buy it, and that would be the money. That would be the money.
Elizabeth Murray, author of 9 books, including Living Life in Full Bloom, has brought new joy and light and community to the house once owned by the Prince of Darkness, Charles Rollo Peters.
We've done a lot of singing in this house, and then we've had concerts here, and it radiates. The house really likes it.
Community weaver Lisa Littlebird personifies love and freedom carried in the camaraderie of song and liberates others to do the same.
All people, all children, in all cultures, for time immemorial, have sung and danced together. We were made for this.
She accepts people who really don't know how to sing or that can't carry a tune very well, but she'll weave them in with love and working with harmonies.
Wholehearted Chorus to me is pure joy. It is my dream job that I feel exceptionally lucky to have crafted, and it's working. It's different than what many other people might call the life of an artist, which has associations with being quite individualized. And so I'm going to curate and sometimes write songs that feed those expressions that we can all step into and create in real time together. Intoxicating to feel that level of connectedness and real-time presence in the act of creating together.
Lisa Littlebird is an advocate for the community and believes in the power of music and art to transform pain.
One of my favorite artistic experiences here on the coast was starting the Big Sur Fashion Show. So it was 2008, it was after the Basin Complex fire, when Big Sur was traumatized one night, and we agreed that, to me, the most healing thing the community could have would be some outlet of expression artistically. We have to find a willingness to express without concern about how we're seen. Then we can create together and we can share together. And for me, that's where the juice and the joy is, for sure.
Within the community, I think artists are usually patrons to one another.
We used to do an artist dinner here, and we had a couple of photographers, we had a poet, we had a sculptor, we had a painter, and we'd meet here. Actually, the deal was that we would go to each other's homes, and the stipulation is that you had to bring new work. So if it was a new poem or a new piece of sculpture or a new painting, or in my case, of course, photography.
The Westons are big believers in sharing their craft with the community, and the community with their children. Kim remembers early exposure to the arts.
There were 4 of us and kids in the family, and we lived down the coast, which property we still have, which was my father's. And they couldn't find a babysitter to go all the way down there. So they would drag us to the theater. And we actually, at the Forest Theater, they used to call it the Underground Theater, had seats with our names written on the back. Ivor, Kim, Reese, Cara. And that's where we sat and during the performances. And of course, these were dramatic plays.
The entrancing Forest Theater was the original site for the Bohemians to bring their creations to luminous life. In later years, the threat of its closing brought the concerned community together to once again pool their creativity as a collective saving surge.
Cole lived and breathed theater. He had a great sense of humor, very handsome man, and charming, and just pulled every string that he could in favor of the Forest Theater. That was his baby.
Herbert Herron, who is sort of the founder of the Forest Theater and the creative juice behind it for 50 years, from 1910 and 1960. And then in 1960 he was done, having health issues and doing some traveling and that kind of thing. The Forest Theater literally was abandoned. So much so that in the late 60s, the city was considering selling it off.
Well, I was driving from LA because of the traffic, decided I'd do some commercials in San Francisco, and drove up the coast, and my Citroen had car trouble, and so I broke down in Carmel, and took 3 weeks to fix it, and by then I'd rented a little house in Carmel, and I never left. And so one morning, I was coming out of my door, and I heard applause. And I said, now that's it. I know what that is, but I wonder where that's coming from. And I looked all around. I found the Forest Theater. And there was a man down in front talking to a little group of people, and he was saying, the city of Carmel wants to tear down the Forest Theater, the oldest outdoor theater in the United States. Cole Weston was the director of the Forest Theater at the time. I said, yeah, I'd like to preserve the theater, and so I got on the board of the Forest Theater, and we did a fundraiser to raise the money to support the theater, and what we did was get Dame Judith Anderson to come back and do Medea, which she had done 50 years before, and packed the house and made a lot of money and saved the Forest Theater.
Cole basically filled that place up and showed the city that it was viable and important, and kind of saved the Forest Theater.
As long as we get audiences, I think that's theater is not a substitute for television. Theater is not a substitute for film. It's of its own creation.
I've been a producer, an actor, a director, a lighting designer, a technician, but I think what has ultimately given me the most satisfaction has been the buildings.
5 impressive venues run shows year-round in Carmel-by-the-Sea, a city of a mere 3,700 residents.
The children's programs over at Pacific Repertory Theater, they do these musicals with like 100 kids in them and stuff like that. But I see that and I go, okay, not all those 100 kids want to get into being actors as a profession, but it's already changed them, They're already experiencing this thing, not showing off in front of an audience. What they're experiencing is a communion between people, gathering, telling story, feeling empathy in the play and the people out there feeling it with them. It creates a community, it creates a wholeness, it creates an understanding that all human beings feel, and that no matter what they end up doing, they're going to be incredibly considerate and thoughtful human beings moving forward.
I just think that theater has to be one of the higher, if I can use the term, higher art forms. I mean, it touches people in the soul.
The soul of a bohemian embraces human connection, and a connection that transcends our senses, knowing we are only part of a greater fabric of life.
This place is filled with all the artists that help us understand the wholeness of life and our part in it. To be a bohemian is essentially to lead a nonconformist life, an unconventional life, and usually has to do with art.
Robinson Jeffers purposefully chose the location of his tour house. He was not in the center of Carmel Village. He was not in proximity to the other artists and writers, and he chose this purposely because he wanted to be in what was more pure nature. Carmel at that point was pure nature, could not see or hear anyone else for a mile.
He wasn't a great talker. He tended to listen more than talk. And that kind of quietness, I think, was really how I remember him, as doing his thing in his head or when he was writing or when he was reading, and just kind of being very internal and very self-contained.
Robinson Jeffers was our quintessential poet and scientist. When you look at his poems, he has the names of the plants. He doesn't just write about beauty and color the way some other authors and poets will do, but he will describe a scene in such a way that I can tell exactly what part of Carmel Valley he was discussing because of the plant names and the specificity. And yet the poetry is above all.
A true scholar and naturalist, Jeffers' studies were relevant to the landscaping of Carmel-by-the-Sea.
There were no trees. He planted many of the trees, planted over 2,000 eucalyptus and cypress.
He planted the trees around the edge of the property, so there's a kind of protection.
Jeffers planted 2,000 trees, devising a way to water them all by hand, changing the coastal silhouette into a living work of art. Jeffers' sensitivity to nature was magnified by his broad knowledge of science, philosophy, and literature. The collection of wisdom gave him a depth of feeling and a perception half a century ahead of his peers.
He would write and rewrite and cross out, and he tended to be very careful with his use of paper. And so he would write, and then he would write in between the lines, and then he would write the side, and he would write poetry on old receipts, old pieces of butcher paper, and it was clearly a really difficult job.
Oh, Lovely Rock, where he looks at the rock and he's talking about the atoms in the rock that are still going to be here centuries from now when everything else is gone. The rock is actually alive because you've got the atoms working in it. Once you start to look at things geologically, it just changes your whole perspective.
Robinson Jeffers, besides being an extraordinary poet, appreciator of beauty, was a hard worker. He built much of the tour house himself. He was out there every day as a stonemason after learning it from Murphy.
When he was working with stone, would be also composing his poetry. And so he would work in the morning on his masonry, whether it was building the tower or later on building the dining room or the new east wing. And while that physical process was going on, I'm pretty sure that was when he was mulling the ideas that were going to become poetry. And then he would write in the afternoon.
So Jeffers built Tour House actually on a Native American site. That Native American presence finds its way into Jeffers' poetry. He was very much aware of the people who had been here before him.
Jeffers' tacit connection to the land transcended the spatial dimensions. In his silence, he tuned into the voices of the original inhabitants.
Here the granite flanks are scarred with ancient fire. The ghosts of the tribe crouch in the nights beside the ghost of a fire. They try to remember the sunlight. Light has died out of their skies. These have paid something for the future. He really liked the fact that the Indians had been here. He felt the connection.
Jeffers was a deep sensitive, passionate, dedicated to his wife, a poet of the highest caliber. Between the lines he wrote, he illuminated the great mystery of life. His prose spanned atomic to etheric, transmitting meaningful, urgent energy to the reader.
The beauty of things, the beauty of transhuman things, without which we are all lost. That's kind of a statement of the idea that the human part of the world is secondary. We're here. We don't have a particularly a natural aspect to us, but we're not the same as nature, but we're part of nature. And yeah, that was one of the things that I gathered from him, that we are only part of nature.
Bohemian, to me, really means, I think, a deep appreciation and love for our natural surroundings, a respect for beauty.
Beauty making is a way of gifting with spirit. It's a collaboration with the spiritual world. And so it's painting, it's making gardens, it's making photographs, it's writing.
We don't know what came first. Were Bohemians attracted here because this place is such a powerful portal of energy and beauty that they were naturally attracted to? Or did the Bohemians bring this energy here? It's a little chicken and an egg. All I know is this is a very powerful part of the world.
I think as a beauty maker, you create a vibration in the place.
Many hands bloomed the beauty that is now Carmel-by-the-Sea. Perhaps the most iconic artist was the humble Joe Mora. His first commissioned work began at the Carmel Mission.
One of the things that's wonderful about Joe's work is that much of it still exists in Carmel and throughout California to this day. We're very fortunate to be able to be sitting in the courtyard of the El Paseo building in downtown Carmel. He was able to create this sculpture that depicts a very kind of intimate early Californian scene with two people bowing towards each other, and it's referred to as the greeting. It's a wonderful tribute to his love of California. This is one of the rare artifacts that still exist from Joe's work, a hand-colored example of one of the dairy milk bottles. What is amazing, though, is how it comes to life when it's full of milk. He worked in virtually every visual art medium that you can imagine. He's one of the rare people who made their entire living through his artwork as well. He did a small map of the Monterey Peninsula. As Joe's map making continued, he eventually created one of Carmel-by-the-Sea. It also highlights Mary Austin, who was one of the early Bohemians, and Robertson Jeffers, who was at the time building his Thor house. Oftentimes, it would take somebody writing a full book to demonstrate the amount of information that Joe was able to put into a single image that was his map of Carmel-by-the-Sea.
My great-grandfather, Frank Devendorf, was really one of the first environmentally conscious planners and developers west of the Mississippi. As you know, he laid out the town of Carmel to really enhance the natural beauty of the area. He and his partner, Frank Powers, one of the things they loved the most was nature and the natural beauty of Carmel.
Over the years, Bohemians that are artists are always inspired by whatever their heart leads them to do. And I guess maybe what defines the Bohemian most is somebody who will act on those things and disregard the rest of the world and be like, this is what needs to be done.
His real vision for Carmel was a town for families. This was his original intention. This is why one of the main things he did in Carmel was he never allowed there to be street addresses in his development, because he said for a town to be a town for families, people needed to know each other.
Money was scarce for the early settlers. Town developer Frank Devendorf got creative with the finance terms to entice new residents.
And I remember many stories my grandmother would tell me about how he would lend them their first $5 for their down payment on their $100 lot, just to get them to come down and enjoy the area.
Devendorf's business partner, Frank Powers, came for the weekend and stayed for a lifetime.
My great-great-grandfather, Frank Powers, actually came to the Carmel area because he was a lawyer in San Francisco. He had a client who couldn't pay his debt and gave Frank a piece of land in exchange for legal fees. And Frank came down here. He took the train from San Francisco to Del Monte Hotel, and then he took a carriage over the hill into what was then this undeveloped Carmel-by-the-Sea area. And it was foggy. He pitched his tent by the Carmel Mission and went to sleep. And he didn't know whether it was a good deal or a bad deal, you know. And in the morning when he woke up, he went for a walk and found himself walking up the white sand beaches of Carmel, and the fog lifted and he saw this sapphire water and these trees and these 20-foot stacks of, piles of sand, and he just thought, this is it. He brought his wife, Jane Powers, down to see this place that he was so excited about. And she insisted that if they were going to relocate from San Francisco to Carmel, which at that point was just a few, there was a hotel and a few homes, but it was very undeveloped, she would need a place to paint.
Jane Powers was the first female to own her own art studio in early Carmel-by-the-Sea. Many would follow her lead. Empowered women were very unique at the time.
Mary Austin was one of the most extraordinary writers of the early 20th century.
The future matriarch of the early Bohemians bloomed in the rich creative firmament of Carmel-by-the-Sea, following a parched 17-year stretch in the Mojave Desert.
She lived with the Indians, which was her words. They weren't called Native Americans in the early 1900s.
Mary Austin wore leather, deerskin Indian garb.
In 1913, her play Fire took the town by storm. No one had seen anything quite like it. A primal parade of costumed characters made for a frightful sight. It was during Fire that Mary began a collaboration with Forest Theater's founder, Herbert Herron, and cast her friend George Sterling in his one and only stage appearance.
George Sterling really appreciated Mary Austin. He admired her work, and he brought her to San Francisco and introduced her to some of his Bohemian Club friends. And so the custom was that the Bohemians would sit at this table and they would vote under the table while they were interviewing. And the women thought they were interviewing them for intellectual participation with the Bohemians, and they were actually interviewing them as to whether they were women they wanted to be around. Now bear in mind, Mary Austin was one of the most important and talented writers of this generation, and they voted to disapprove her. There were commentaries afterward that she was not the muse we're looking for.
Well, I consider her an early feminist because of her influence on women and the women artists that were here. She was a very strong starter in the colony, and she was strong. And she was a character, she was a pioneer. She wrote extraordinary books about women.
The men, in many cases, even though they appreciated the artistry and the writings of women, they viewed them as what was called muses, and what we would call they viewed them for their beauty and charm more than their talent.
Carmel-by-the-Sea became a safe haven for women to break from the Victorian shackles and begin the energy of equality. The peninsula became a place to claim their own artistic freedom.
Carmel, I think, really became a place for both genders where that vision of theater, of literature, of music was realized by the decisions the Powers made with the Devendorfs to create opportunities for these artistic and cultural institutions to have a home base. The Carmel Arts and Crafts Club.
Erin Lee Gaffel's artistic heritage took her by surprise as a teenager. She discovered the woman that she knew as a grandmother.
because she had a fascinating life, and she really followed her dreams at a time when women were often setting their dreams aside to satisfy the collective shoulds and to raise families. So I started writing about her, and as I was writing, I thought, well, I should take an oil painting class to familiarize myself with what that's like so I can better understand who she was. That was like nothing I'd ever felt before. And from that point onward, just because I was studying art and painting in order to understand Jane Powers better, my whole life changed, and oil painting and painting the landscape and painting has become the foundation of my life.
It's really pretty neat to have that continuation. And that's why I always say that Carmel hasn't been created, it's being created. It's a continuance. It keeps going, and it keeps getting better.
There is some strong energy in each one of us that needs to be expressed. And whether it's through gardening or cooking or painting, it's just what makes us human. It's this gift that we're each given. And I absolutely believe that when we can tap into it and really fan that flame, our life is transformed, and that creative spark is really our human birthright.
I think a young person, there has to be a passion. And the passion is not that you do it for any other reason but yourself. If you have that passion, everything else sort of falls into place.
So as much as I'm worried about the Bohemian culture getting pushed out by just economics, I also know that it's alive and well. Strangely, it's like that grass blade breaking through the concrete. It will always be here because it's in the blood and bones of the Monterey Peninsula to support the unconventional free thinker. Someone who is artistically inclined will find inspiration here 12 months out of the year.
I'm finding over and over living here is that artists can live deeply fulfilling and financially successful lives. And I know many who are doing so, including myself.
My project for the past 4 years has been to create and bring together photographs and stories that are for a journal called Bohemian. And it's sort of a cultivation of what I call an arts activism journal. And so it's artists, people as artists, as activists, and then my documentation and stories about them and people that I think are making a difference.
To me, the Bohemian is everyone. Everyone has Bohemian in them. It's not someone else. It's not them or they. It's we and us. We are all that. And we all love to find it. We love to find that simplicity, that peace within ourselves, and through that, through art, perhaps we can show it to someone. Maybe we can express it.
Creativity is not limited to artists. It is a feminine principle of connection and taking action through that connection and making something happen. I think is really just being heart-centered and acting from that place as much as possible.
Everyone is Bohemian. It's not them. It's they. It's us. We. And to just let it out is what you strive to do.
Oh, I just kind of feel like that describes it. I mean, the soul is our light. It's our interior, and we are here to let it shine. You know, treat people with grace and kindness, and let's get over whatever's tearing this planet apart right now. Because quite frankly, if we don't have a Bohemian soul, we're going to lose our lives.
Robinson Jeffers wrote this particular piece sitting on Carmel Beach. And man, dissevered from the earth and stars and his history, for contemplation or in fact, often appears atrociously ugly. Integrity is wholeness. The greatest beauty is organic wholeness. The wholeness of life and things, the divine beauty of the universe. Love that. Not man apart from that. Or else you will share man's pitiful confusions or drown in despair when his days darken. It's more apt than ever.
I guess I just want to say that there's a bohemian in everyone, and long live the bohemians and the bohipsians.
Creativity. It is a part of everyone. It's how you got here. It is you. It's not just some of us. Creativity and self-expression are part of all of us. As Martha Graham so eloquently said, there is a vitality, a life force, an energy, a quickening that is translated through you into action. And because there is only one of you in all of time, this expression is unique. And if you block it, it will never exist through any other medium and it will be lost. The world will not have it. It is not your business to determine how good it is, nor how valuable, nor how it compares with other expressions. It is your business to keep it yours clearly and directly, to keep the channel open. You do not even have to believe in yourself or your work. You have to keep yourself open and aware to the urges that motivate you. Keep the channel open. Bohemian Soul, a Colony Awakens.